What's up, Slidell High students or whoever else? I am Mr. Mack coming to you live with some of the best in the business. First, I have Mr. Dufo, aka Coach Dufo. How's it going?
It's going great. I see that your name on this little discussion tonight, too, is U.S. history is better than world history. So I had to subsequently defend my honor and change my name to world history is better than U.S. history. I hope you understand.
And I would expect nothing less from you, good sir. And next, we have got Coach Franzak, also one of the best in the business. Sir, how's it going? How's the quarantine treating you?
It's treating me all right. Just trying to stay alive, trying to stay sane.
And then we have the one and only Coach T, Coach Tyler Dutrich. How's it going?
It's going well. It's really dark on I-10 heading east right now, but pretty fun.
It kind of looks like you're in witness protection, but they had to do like a documentary with you in it, but we couldn't see your face.
It sounds
It's redacted.
I promised y'all in the group text earlier that I was going to give y'all all your Marvel superhero comps, and so I thought now would be a good time to do that. First, for Coach Franzak, you are obviously Jarvis/Vision, a man of few words, but very, very sincere, strong. And when you do speak, it means a lot. And then for Coach Dufo, you are obviously, in Franzak, you guessed this earlier, you are Dr. Strange. You are to the point, you're intelligent, but more than anything else, you are enamored with the Eastern arts.
Oh, my God.
And the Eastern wisdom.
It was predictable.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
And then I know what y'all think I'm going to say for Dutrich, but it's not Thor, even though it would make a lot of sense. And it's not Hulk.
That was my guess. No.
It says a lot about Dutrich that he's very easy to compare to a superhero. Okay, and obviously it's Captain America. Captain America because, one, he's not a fan of Nazis at all. But two, he teaches U.S. history. Three, he looks like Captain America. Do I need to say more?
I mean, he's Thor, but okay.
Yeah. Thor, Hulk, that would be my top two. I would have even made a bid for Tony Stark, just on the military comparison.
Tony Stark was actually my other one for you, Dufo. I was thinking you, yeah.
Okay.
But I do have one for myself. Actually, I have two for myself. I think at best, Peter Parker or Spider-Man, and then at worst, pre-serum Captain America. That one felt
that means you get to
natural.
evolve into me.
Well, you used to wear glasses, and then the kid said we looked alike, and I really liked that. And then you stopped wearing glasses, and they stopped saying that. So
bring back the glasses.
Oh yeah.
But anyways, so after this very, very long extended intro, we are today talking about the atomic bombs that America dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and really just a larger discussion on atomic weapons and atomic energy in general. So since most of that happened in World War II, most of the action that we're talking about today happened in World War II, Coach Franzak or Coach Dutrich, can y'all sort of maybe tag team or one of y'all take how America entered into World War II?
Go ahead, Dutrich.
I was gonna say, man, age before beauty, but so I guess I'll go into the obvious one is Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor was attacked, our hand is kind of forced into World War II. But interestingly enough, prior to Pearl Harbor, most people were heavy isolationists. So, the fact that the Japanese Empire attacked us and brought us into the war and set us on the course that eventually happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I'm definitely gonna let Mr. Dufo touch upon this one as to why they felt it was necessary to attack us. It sets up for the perfect storm for what would eventually be our involvement in World War II on both Eastern and Western fronts, or Pacific and European theaters. But yeah, just with the Japanese attack on us and us being on the ropes and then us having to fight and claw our way back, island hopping, eventually we had to make a tough choice at Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Do you have anything to add to that, Coach Tranzak?
Yeah, I think another thing that needs to be said is that we were heavily trading with a lot of our trade partners. Great Britain, France, and we had an embargo against Japan, and we were really damaging them economically to the extent that they felt like they had to do a preemptive attack in Pearl Harbor while they still had an adequate amount of resources. And you got to factor in things like unrestricted submarine warfare, which the Germans were practicing. And, there's a whole other economic aspect to it as well. We were definitely trading with our buddies in the war for sure.
Awesome. So, Mr. Coach Dufo, do you want to sort of give the Japanese side of this? And you can go as far back as you want. If you want to go all the way back to Commodore Matthew Perry, or you certainly can, or if you just want to start a little bit sooner, whatever you want to do.
Right. I could touch briefly on Perry, and that's, there's some arguments out there in theory that the United States really creates the modern mess that it gets itself into with Japan due to the opening of the country, due to Perry and the United States stance on essentially forcing the Japanese to essentially open its gates to Westerners as opposed to allowing it to be an isolationist nation. But then there's other instances in world history that build up to that. You can look at the Spanish-American War, the sneak attack on Manila Bay by the United States Naval Forces. That is right there in Japan's backyard. In fact, it's been said that Japan had actually learned from that attack as sort of a motivation for how they went about the Pearl Harbor attacks. In that sense. So in a sense, you can look at it as the United States had built up the mess that they're now in with Japan all the way back in the 1800s. Now, fast forward to today, and we see that Japan, at least in the context we're talking about right now with World War II, is on the verge of collapse, but they are willing to go down with the ship, so to speak. They have petitioned conditional surrender to the United States, and obviously those were rejected based on the terms. But the Japanese citizens themselves were actually preparing for an invasionary force. One story I picked up on, I think it was the World War II conference. I think it was 2018. Where one of the speakers mentioned about how they were essentially going about every day in Japanese school. They were an elementary student at the time. And their normal gym, which or like we call it gym class here, was replaced with suddenly they were in groups of 4, basically a squad of 4. And they had daily objectives: dig a hole, time yourself running to that hole, and then covering yourself. Things like that. And what happened next is, basically like they would go into these sort of settings and they would learn years later that they were actually being trained to become essentially kamikaze soldiers. In the sense they were going to become soldiers that purposefully blew up U.S. tanks as they rolled by, or U.S. squadrons as they rolled by, essentially becoming agents of war themselves. That's what their normal thing was. But basically, the Japanese citizens themselves were preparing not just for a long invasionary war, but they were preparing to die to the last man, if necessary.
Awesome. So, Mr. Coach Dufo, could you maybe give us a little bit of parallel introduction into how Japan got into the war, or at the very least how they got to this point in the war as far as desperate enough to launch Pearl Harbor, and then setting up America to sort of just about have no choice but to drop those bombs?
Right. So there's a long road you can take that would take hours to describe, which I can summarize in just maybe a minute or two. But basically, we can look at sort of this sleeping giant being awoken by the United States themselves back in the 1850s with the arrival of Commodore Perry, the opening of Japan, essentially the destruction of the Tokugawa regime, the emergence or reemergence really of imperial power under the Meiji. and essentially the build up towards nationalism in Japan as a whole. We're going to see examples throughout history up to Pearl Harbor that the United States sort of gives Japan some examples to go off of. The most famous one being the attack on Manila Bay in the Spanish-American War, where Japan really bases a lot of its premise on sneak attack at Pearl Harbor off of that one attack right there. Now, we look at where we're at in the war, where we're at the end of the war. The Japanese want a conditional surrender. They want to be able to keep certain things. They want to be able to make sure the emperor has total and absolute power, that the emperor is absolved of any crime or wrongdoing. And the U.S. at that time is just not ready to concede that. What happens then is the Japanese government is essentially preparing its citizens for the inevitable, which is an invasionary force. The United States coming in with an invasionary army that they're estimating to be pretty high. I'm not going to give those totals away. I think Franzak or Dietrich wanted to mention that. But I will say that some of the citizens were preparing as if they were going to become soldiers, some without even knowing. There's one story about a elementary student. She was older when she presented at a conference in 2018, which, obviously this is back in the 1940s, 2018, do the math. Anyway, during school every day, sometimes, we have gym class at a school. Well, they had something like that too. Theirs started to evolve a little bit differently. Suddenly they were digging holes in certain locations around their local towns or principalities. And then sometimes the gym teacher at the time would be timing them to make it there with their squad and basically duck and cover, hide, things like that. And sometimes they'd be basically holding packages, so to speak, when they go into these hiding places. And they didn't know what they were doing until they learned a couple of years later after the war that they had actually been training their school children, third, fourth graders at the time, think about this, to be essentially kamikaze, to basically blow up tanks, to blow up enemy troops as they march by in the event that this invasionary force happens. So essentially the Japanese people were pushing all their chips to the middle and saying, we're all in and bring it on.
Yeah, and that's, to me, a really interesting part of the story, and one that you could almost do a whole other discussion about, is that element of Japanese character. Because if you don't understand that, you really don't understand Pearl Harbor, and you don't understand the two atomic bombs that America drops, because that is so ingrained, that death before dishonor mentality seems to be so ingrained in Japanese culture that you have to have an understanding of that in order to understand anything else that we're going to talk about here.
Definitely.
Hey, Dufo, let me ask you a question, man.
Yeah.
So, I did some reading on this subject, and I heard that the U.S. government offered not necessarily two terms of surrenders, but we offered two separate occasions when we wanted them to surrender. And on the first occasion, they wanted the Japanese emperor to completely and utterly surrender, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, they rejected that, right?
Yep.
But on the second time, they changed the wording on it a little bit so as to give the emperor a way out. Mm-hmm. So I think if I can get the quote right, it was they demanded I don't think they used the word unconditional, but they demanded the surrender of the Japanese military forces. Mm-hmm. So one thing that's interesting is that they changed the terms up a little bit so as to give the emperor a way out, a scapegoat, or a way out of having to say that, oh, I just completely surrendered. Mm-hmm. It was this military that surrendered, not me.
Right.
So I think that's, pretty interesting.
I think in that respect too, it's there was a lack of trust on the Japanese part in that purpose, mainly because when you are the loser in a war, when you are essentially capitulating to the enemy forces, treaties and terms can often be changed to the point where suddenly the emperor can be thrown back in that conversation. The emperor could become a target for the start of World War II. And there's some speculation that the emperor might have had some knowledge or some hand in the initial Pearl Harbor attacks on the U.S., but that was sort of the great fear of the Japanese, is that they don't want anything to happen to the royal line. They don't want anything to happen to the emperor or his household, because the emperor is literally the connection to the Japanese past. And that is, Unfortunately, when we get to that time period, they are not thinking about surrender at that point, because once that first one's off the table, even if they change the wording up just slightly, there is that paranoia that they might go back and potentially backstab us in that sense. So, and